Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why both bodybuilders and powerlifters, for their own ego reasons, oftentimes don't want to admit that the big three are just a test of strength with no real skill. And again, that's going to sound funny to people. And when I say no real skill, I don't mean maxing out isn't a skill. Hitting a 1 rep max is a skill, right? Hitting a 1 rep max is a skill. But these are three exercises that have more or less been randomly selected. They're big exercises that use a lot of muscle, and when the three are combined together, they give you a very, very good idea of a person's overall strength, and in a way that can be measured and quantified and compared to other people. Okay, that's it. We could pick three other similar exercises, and as long as all the muscles in the body got used, it would be a good comparison also. And also, people need to remember when I say the three, I don't mean just one, because sometimes someone will say, well, this guy can deadlift more than other people, and I don't think he's stronger or more jacked. We're not talking about one lift, we're talking about doing all three. Because someone who's a phenomenal deadlifter due to leverages is most likely not a very good bench presser, and vice versa. Whereas, and also the bench press is very, very, very reliant upon upper body muscle mass. The squat is very, very reliant on lower body muscle mass. The deadlift is reliant upon back strength, leverage is grip strength. Okay, they all test something totally different. So you people who are oftentimes genetically good at one of the three might be really bad at one of the others. Okay, so they actually are a balanced test of strength. The only thing they don't test is the bicep. I heard someone say throw in a fourth lift of the strict curl and add it to the total. Now some people would laugh and say, well, that wouldn't affect the total enough to matter. But the biceps are one of the smallest muscles in the body that people care about, so that would make sense. But I digress. That aside, let's come over to the point. These are all low skill exercises. They're all relatively low skill exercises, and I'm not saying there isn't some skill involved, but a perfect conventional deadlift, I can take a person who has never performed a deadlift in their entire life, and I can teach them a perfect conventional deadlift inside of 15 minutes inside of a gym. And anyone who can't perfect a conventional deadlift with a basic online tutorial, that's really scary. Really scary. And it's usually really young men who have an ego issue with it. Almost anybody else can perfect it off of just reading a basic instruction or a tutorial. And I mean perfect it. And the conventional deadlift has no skill. No skill at all. The squat, the hardest of them, but fairly easy to learn. Just there's a lot of bad advice out there. Bench press, also very easy to learn. Now, getting perfect bench press leverages, getting everything perfect, a perfect bar path, that could take years. But just getting to 90% of your potential, you can learn that real quick. You can learn that in one training session. Again, people don't listen though. If they'll just follow basic instructions, the bench is not particularly complicated. Now, learning to set up a great arch, learning the perfect bar path, learning how to use leg drive, okay, those things take time. But they don't add that much to the bench. Maybe 10%. All right, so a person who benches 300 pounds who potato presses 300 might be able to get to 330 with really, really great technique. So what does all of this tell us? They're just a test of strength. They're just a test of strength. So people would say, well, why then doesn't want people to want to admit that? Well, for two reasons. It has to do with their ego in both directions. Either people don't want to admit that they are weak, and powerlifters don't want to admit that maybe the skills that they practice aren't particularly relevant, and that they should probably oftentimes frequently work on just getting bigger and stronger. Right? A lot of powerlifters want to put so much effort into perfecting, and dialing in this perfect technique, which is fine if you're a novice. Once you're past the novice phase, you're not going to dial in and perfect your technique dramatically more on those three lifts. I'm not saying you can't, but it's usually going to be muscular weaknesses that have to be addressed. And that's what oftentimes the powerlifters don't want to admit. They don't want to admit that they at a certain threshold, you just need to get jacked. At a certain threshold to get good at those lifts, the powerlifter just needs to say, look, I just need to put another 1.5 or 2 inches on my hamstrings. I need to build my erectors. I need to build my triceps and my delts. I just need to stack meat on them. Because they don't want to admit that they know that they need to get bigger. They don't want to admit that even the studies that have looked at it have found once you're out of the novice phase, almost all strength you gain on the big three as a powerlifter comes from pure hypertrophy. In the right places, of course. They don't want to admit that they just need to get more jacked. Because they don't want to do anything that looks anything remotely like what bodybuilder does. They don't want to. Because, again, there's a rivalry there. It's a dislike oftentimes back and forth. And understandably so. I dislike bodybuilding. Right? Even though I mostly do 10 rep sets these days, I don't like bodybuilding. I dislike bodybuilding. I dislike the culture, and I dislike anything about it. In fact, I refuse to call doing high rep tricep extensions, I refuse to call it bodybuilding, because it's not. But that's where it happens. It's purely because people refer to training for hypertrophy as bodybuilding. That is one reason that a lot of powerlifters will not admit that they just need to get bigger. That's it. That's the only reason. Because they don't like bodybuilding, and rightly so. Okay? Rightly so. What about bodybuilders? Why don't bodybuilders want to admit that? Because bodybuilders don't want to admit oftentimes that they're weak. They don't want to admit that they oftentimes have major muscle imbalances. Because a lot of guys who chase the whole aesthetics thing, and I'm not always talking about the biggest, most jacked bodybuilders. I mean, obviously guys like Ronnie Coleman were ridiculously strong. Here's what bodybuilders don't want to admit. They don't want to admit that they haven't built oftentimes real hypertrophy through training. That it's oftentimes just copious amounts of substances that got them there. That's one. Because we know that the more anabolics you use and the less heavy weight you use to build muscle, the weaker you tend to be, pound for pound. There's been studies on that looked at that. They don't want to admit that they're just lazy. The other thing, the aesthetics guys don't want to admit that they don't have as much muscle as they think they do. Because what do you find very, very quickly? A lot of times they'll be good at a bench, maybe. A lot of the guys chasing aesthetics don't build their go muscles. They don't have lats. They don't have erectors. They don't have hamstrings. They don't have glutes. They have muscles that when they look in a mirror in the front, look good. But anything from behind and oftentimes from the side, they don't have any size or thickness because they haven't built the things. And it's not because those muscles wouldn't make them look better. A big, wide, thick back can be pretty impressive when you turn around and people see it. Okay? Be pretty impressive. But a lot of those guys don't want to admit that they've only trained the front half of their body. Well, what happens when you start doing tests of strength? Well, things like your back, and I mean your entire back, it makes a big deal when it comes to squatting and deadlifting. Matters a lot. They don't want to admit that they don't have full muscular development. They don't want to admit that they have weak cores. They don't want to admit they have weak spinal erectors, weak abs, weak hips, because they really haven't trained that hard. They haven't really built as much muscle as they think they have. There's a reason a lot of times people say, well, I don't know, that guy, he looks really great, and he's only whatever weight. Well, yeah, because he doesn't have that much muscle. That's why he's at that weight and height. He's lean, and he's just built a few muscles. He's built half the muscles in his body. That guy would be 10 pounds heavier, 15 pounds heavier had he actually trained top to bottom. He's got a lot of pec, a lot of shoulder, some arm, maybe a little bit of quad. That's about it. That's about it. And most of those guys really don't have a back, because a lot of the guys that I see people say, well, I think that guy's got that aesthetic physique, and then he turns around and he doesn't have a back. I promise you that guy can't do weighted pull-ups with any respectable weight. Well, if he does, it's because he doesn't have legs. So what ends up happening is that those guys don't want to admit that, number one, they're not strong. So they want to claim, oh, yeah, that's just leverages and skill. And no, you're just not strong. And you have major muscle imbalances. You have entire muscles through your entire body that you haven't bothered to develop. So you're not as big or as jacked as you think you are. You just have big arms and some pecs and some side delts, and that's it. Okay? You've only trained half of your body. You've left half of it virtually untrained and in a noob state. Or because you just refuse to ever touch anything heavy, you're just weak. And that's all it comes down to. It's both of these groups of people not wanting to admit that either they haven't developed muscle as much as they should have, that they're just weak, or in some cases they really want to believe that they've developed a huge amount of skill perfecting their technique. And the reality is these are just brute strength exercises. Technique matters. It absolutely matters, but it's brute strength and hypertrophy really determines 90% of what you lift on these exercises relative to your body's leverages. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.